in, but we do have quite a lot of material to get through today. Today was supposed to be, oh, no problem, Natalie. Today was supposed to be the field trip, which I'm so bummed about. And so we were supposed to look at the, we actually have a botanical garden at Madera Center that is by the back parking lot, and not everyone knows about it. It's just like open. You can just go through it when campus is open. So when campus reopens, I really encourage you to go through it. But on the last day that I was on campus, I went through and I took pictures of a ton of the plants that were there. So we're going to, yeah, you can just go in. It's unlocked all the time. You don't have to schedule a tour. It's like for you guys to go and relax and walk around there. So yeah, that's why I wanted to have the field trip, so you guys would feel comfortable going there and finding it and chilling out there. But I went there the last day that campus was open for us, and I just took tons of pictures. And so we're going to talk a little bit about plants generally, and then I'll show you a bunch of the cool plants that are there so that when campus reopens, you can go find some of them. Not this semester, but hopefully sometime in the future. And I will keep the chat open. So if you, well, hopefully I can get open. Okay, it's not letting me open the chat, but if you have like a serious concern, just turn on the voice chat really fast and check in with me. So we're going to be talking about today diversity of plants. So in the past couple of learning units, we've talked kind of broadly about the nature of science and about like cells and chemistry of life. We talked about cell processes and DNA processes. The week where we were not on campus, we were transitioning to online, I made slides for evolution, but I have not recorded the lectures for those yet. I will get that done, and that material, there will just be like maybe 1 or 2 questions on the final exam, so it shouldn't be too much stuff on the final. But that, again, was not on the most recent exam. We're kind of shifting it backwards. So we're going to be thinking about the diversity of plants today, the diversity of animals on Wednesday, and then we'll really focus on human body systems for the rest of the semester. So today, we're again thinking about tissue systems, even though plants are, we think of them as just being plants. They're not like animals. They actually do have tissue systems, and they're pretty complex, and they're really similar to ours in a lot of ways. So we'll think about the dermal system, the vascular system, and the ground system. We'll define this term called meristem and think about how it relates to mitosis. Remember, we talked about that form of cell division, and we'll distinguish between primary and secondary growth. Some plants have no vascular system or seeds. Some plants have a vascular system but no seeds, and some have different types of seeds with a vascular system. So we'll think about those different classifications of plants and really the diversity of plants. We'll look at different types of flowering plants, and then we'll explore some local plants from that local garden. And also, I just want to remind you, like, science is very, very visual and very beautiful. I think we have this misconception that it's just people looking at test tubes in lab coats and that it's very dry and sterile, but scientists are curious humans. That's really all they are. And basically anyone who's curious about the world around them and wants to find out more is a scientist. So science is really beautiful. It doesn't have to be boring. So I wanted to go through some key structures of plants and think about how they grow. So again, thinking about those processes like mitosis and where they're happening in different parts of the plant. So just like how we have tissue systems, like our epithelial skin tissue and our connective tissue and our muscles and our nervous tissue, plants also have tissue systems. So they have 3 particular tissue systems, and these tissue systems can be found at any point in the plant. Basically, if you cut the plant open at any given point, you can see examples of these different tissue systems. So there's dermal, vascular, and ground. I'll introduce the function of dermal tissue and ground tissue first, and then touch on vascular tissue after that. So the dermal tissue, just like a dermatologist is someone who studies the skin, the dermal system of a plant is basically the plant's skin. It does something similar to ours. It prevents water loss and it prevents infection. It basically keeps that internal environment of the plant separate from the external environment and keeps it safe. So some leaves have that like waxy substance on it, or if you think about cucumbers, they're kind of waxy. That is the cuticle of the plant. It's like a waxy surface layer that helps with that dermal system, keeping it safe. The dermal system does have openings in it, just like how we have pores in our skin. That's important for letting carbon dioxide into the plant and water and oxygen out of the plant. There's also the ground system, which is kind of like the meat of the plant. That's where metabolism, photosynthesis, storage, and growth all take place. So if you think about a leaf, it has that protective dermal layer. It has the ground system where it's undergoing photosynthesis, and then it has to be able to take products of photosynthesis and move them to other parts of the plant. So that happens using the vascular system. The vascular system consists of two tissue types. There's the xylem, which is dead cells, basically like a bunch of straws packed together. These move water up the plant. So at the start of the semester, when we were talking about those hydrogen bonds, I showed you the example of evaporation, where I pulled a couple people on those rolly chairs. So we had the hydrogen bonds connecting us. I was evaporating out of the top of the xylem and out of the leaf, and then I was pulling the rest of my water molecules with me. So that is happening out of the xylem through a process called transpiration. And going from the very bottom of the soil to the top of a tree doesn't require any energy, it's just properties of water. When we take sugars that are made in the leaf and pack them into what's called the phloem, that does take energy, because you're having to take these big sugars and move them against their concentration gradient. There's already a ton of sugar at the top of that phloem. Now you have to pack a bunch more sugar on there, and that's just not really the way things flow. So that phloem requires extra energy. So when we have that opening of the stomata, that lets water evaporate out of the xylem through transpiration. So that stomata from the dermal system is really important for facilitating movement in the vascular system. And just like how our vascular system has arteries and veins and it moves stuff all throughout our body, their vascular system has xylem and phloem and it moves stuff all throughout their body too. These two images on the bottom right are examples of a dicot stem and a dicot root. And so you see these groupings of these holes basically. Those are the straws that are all bundled together. It's like taking a bundle of straws and just staring at it, and there's all these openings in it. That's where the material is flowing up and down the plant. So whether you're looking at a stem or a root, that's what you're looking at, this opening that allows material to flow through. So you should know kind of the basic function of dermal tissue, of ground tissue, and of vascular tissue. When we're thinking about growth occurring, we're thinking about these specific sites called meristems. Meristems are sites of mitosis. So you should know that a meristem is a region of the plant where there's a lot of new cell growth, a lot of mitosis taking place. There's one of these at the shoot of the plant. And so those are cells that are being built up on top of the plant and growing upward. There's also one in the root of the plant that's protected by the root cap. If you looked at the mitosis onion root tip in lab, you were looking at this meristematic region where there's a lot of new cells being made. So that shoot system grows up, it shoots up. The root system roots it in place by growing down. So the thing to remember here is that that meristematic region is at the tip of the plant. It's going to make new cells, and those cells are basically going to stay where they are, and then the meristem is going to keep moving upward and keep making new cells. So we can visualize this a little bit better by looking at roots developing under the soil. When you plant seeds, that seed basically stays in place. There's a meristem. Let me get my annotation thing. Oh, hang on just a moment. Nope. Okay, the chat thing finally came back. Okay, so let me get this to play again. So when we're watching this, we see that the seed is staying where it is. There's new cells here, and then here, and then here. And those cells that were formed right here are just gonna stay there, and they're gonna grow and mature. The cells that are made right here are gonna stay there. The cells that are made right here are going to stay there. So the new cells are being made at the tips of the plant at what are called the apical meristems. So we can just watch that one more time. When cells are produced, they remain where they are, they grow, they mature, they differentiate, and then new cells are made at the tip of the plants. So when we see this, we see a lot of like fuzzy things growing out as well. Roots are important for anchoring the plant, but they're also super important for absorbing material like water and different nutrients, not carbon that contributes to the mass of the plant, but just like different like water and like taking a multivitamin basically. So they absorb micronutrients and water. So that surface area is really important. So they end up getting a bunch of these root hairs that are really thin and basically increase the surface area to absorb stuff. Okay, so I have a quick thought experiment for you guys. If you carve your initials into a tree, where do you think they would be in 10 years? And we're gonna go ahead and open up the participant window. So hover over the bar at the bottom of your screen and hit that participant button. If you think they will be higher in 10 years, click yes. If you think they'll be lower, click no. And if you think they'll be in the same place, click go slower. So higher, lower, same place. Oh, you might not be able to access it on the phone. You can just write it in the chat. So you can write higher, lower, or same place. Okay, so it looks like a lot of people are guessing higher and some people are guessing same place. It would actually be in the exact same place. So if we think about, let me open up the annotation thing again. So let's say that we carve initials right here. Remember that new cells are being made here and also up here, and then eventually up here and up here. So if you carve your initials right here on the trunk of the tree, the new cells aren't going to be made right here and pushing it upward. There's going to be new cells growing out down this way and new cells growing up this way. But all of these guys are going to stay exactly where they are. So we'll actually be in the exact same place. So you should know that primary growth means that that growth is going to be packed on at the edges of the plant. Stuff in the middle is going to remain exactly where it is. So does that make sense to people? This time you can use the yes and no buttons for yes and no. Okay. And I'm just moving some of these windows around because there's a lot of them. Okay, so again, this is an example of what we call primary growth. With a lot of plants, this is the only kind of growth they have. So if you think about something like a vine, like a jasmine, or if you think about a weed in the ground, they're not packing on a lot of secondary growth. They're not getting wider. But with the tree, that initial that you carve might actually move out to the side because that tree is experiencing something called secondary growth. So when you cut down a tree and you look at the tree rings, that's what you're observing, these layers of xylem and phloem that get packed on as the tree grows outward. And so this takes place at things called lateral meristems. Lateral means side. So this is growth that is occurring at the side. There's a whole subreddit dedicated to trees eating things. And so these are just some examples of different items that were left next to trees, but then as the trees packed on secondary growth, they basically consumed whatever they were next to. The image in the top left is a golf ball in the center of a tree. It was next to that tree, and then it eventually just got consumed by the tree. I think that's super cool. So just a quick kind of note about how diverse plants are. I think that we oftentimes think about all plants as being the same. They're kind of green, they photosynthesize, they're all super similar, but plants are so different. And like the difference between a pine tree and a flowering plant is like the difference between us and an insect, between a vertebrate and an invertebrate. They are so different. So I wanted to kind of share with you some distinctions between different types of plants and how they vary in terms of their life strategies. We're also going to reflect a little bit on the evolution material that we didn't have a lecture for yet. So I just wanted to revisit it here so that you get some of that material. So all life originally arose in the oceans. Our planet is covered in oceans, and that's where a lot of the original bacteria and the universal common ancestor were located. So in water, we have a lot of benefits. We're constantly surrounded by water. We're constantly surrounded by nutrients. We can just release waste products directly into that water. We don't have to hold them in our body. So when you're transitioning to land, there's a lot of challenges that you face. One of them is the relative scarcity of water. You're going from literally being surrounded in water to having to locate it in a terrestrial environment. So there's scarcity of water, and there's also, now we have to deal with this weight of gravity. So if you think about people who are kind of like recuperating from different conditions, or if you think about like water therapy, sometimes being in the water really helps us take the gravity off of our body. It helps us like float around and heal. If we're going from water to land, now we have to walk upright and we have to deal with that gravity. So if you think about a jellyfish just floating around in the water, it's kind of not having to deal with that gravity. It's just floating around, getting its nutrients. As soon as that jellyfish washes up on land, it is crumpled. It is no longer able to withhold itself and support itself with that weight of gravity. So why would we bother moving to land at all? There's a few good reasons for wanting to do that. So one of them is this idea of an ecological niche. When we're in a particular area, there's only a certain amount of space and resources and things to do where there's only like enough room for certain individuals. So if you have more and more individuals, people are going to have to start spreading out and occupying different niches. So a niche is how you use all of those living or biotic and non-living or abiotic resources within the environment. We kind of use this in day-to-day terms, like finding your niche is finding your perfect job or space in the community. So when we're thinking about why organisms want to go to different locations and occupy different niches, there's resource competition when you do have similar niches. And so you're able to reduce that resource competition and also make use of lots of available resources. So for example, the bay-breasted warbler, the Cape May warbler, and the yellow-rumped warbler are all warblers. They all are a similar type of bird with a common ancestor, but they all have slightly different features that have evolved over time. They have different adaptations to their environment. And so they're able to occupy different spots of the same tree. They're able to get different resources from those different locations so they can all coexist and not have to compete with one another. We see this also with shorebirds. There's different structures that are exaggerated to allow them to occupy these different niches. So when we're thinking about why plants specifically would want to live on land instead of in the ocean, one benefit is that there is so much carbon dioxide on land. And we don't necessarily want carbon dioxide, but plants love it. That's how they are able to accomplish photosynthesis. And so plants were able to access more carbon dioxide. There's carbon dioxide dissolved in water, but they get a lot more of it on land for photosynthesis. There's also a lot more nutrients and minerals in the soil on land than there is in seawater. And also a lot of the things that ate or infected plants lived in the water. So transitioning to land meant better survival. So I want to take a moment and pause because we didn't necessarily go through the evolution lecture as a class. Evolution is just kind of gradual change over time. I will post those lectures so it makes a little bit more sense. I know that a lot of you probably have very different perspectives on it. Maybe you've learned different things in your churches or in your communities or in your families. There's a lot of misconceptions about evolution. It's not necessarily directional. It's just kind of who survives and what works. So for example, there might be or like we're thinking about antibiotic resistance. There are some bacteria that just don't have a structure that a drug is targeting. And so those are the ones that are likely to survive and replicate and then make up most of the population. Over time, that antibiotic no longer works on them because the population has changed to better reflect what was able to survive. So that's all we mean by evolution, is this gradual change over time. So with plants, it's not like they were like, oh, being on land is going to be sick, let's go do that. It's not intentional like that. It's just kind of, some of them washed up on land, some of them survived, some of them had adaptations. The ones with those adaptations were able to reproduce and then kept reproducing. So when we're thinking about different things that plants do need to survive on land, there's a few key adaptations that had to happen in order for that transition to be done. One is making sure that their embryos were protected when they weren't released directly into water. So there had to be the formation of spores or seeds in order to make sure that those embryos got to move around and get dispersed. Some land plants are still dependent on water, others are less so. There's also vascular tissue. So if water is limited, you have to have a way of getting it up from the soil and moving it around the plant because you're not anymore surrounded by it. And then finally, seeds and fruits really helped with that dispersal and with the protection of embryos. There's some plants that still don't have vascular systems or seeds. Mosses are land plants, but they don't have vascular systems and they don't have seeds. Ferns do have vascular systems, but they don't have seeds. So we're going to talk about some of these diverse plants. When we say this term bryophyte, that is a grouping or a lineage of plants that includes mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Mosses you've probably heard of, liverworts and hornworts maybe not. But mosses, you find them on basically any like wet rocks. In some of our yards we get mosses, definitely in like ponds or in fish tanks sometimes. So those mosses don't have a vascular system, which means that they can't get very tall. But sometimes when you look at moss, it has these little stalks sticking up. Those stalks are sporophytes. And so that's kind of just one of their reproductive strategies. They can make eggs and sperm, and they can also release these spores. So they rely on water for reproduction, but they are able to survive a little bit better on land. There's also pteridophytes, which include ferns. Ferns are very advanced seedless vascular plants. They can be as small as mosses, but also as big as trees. So they can get very, very large. And they actually don't have seeds. They have these little kind of circles underneath their leaves called sori. And those sori are basically packed together spores. If you look at ferns under a microscope, when they get exposed to light and heat, they burst out those spores. So you can kind of watch them exploding out of the sori if you look at them underneath a microscope. Those spores get released, they germinate, and then the ferns are able to reproduce sexually. So they have these really complex life cycles. I have an example of that on the next slide. You don't need to memorize it. But you can see, like, this is the life cycle of a single fern, and it is wild. There's a lot of stuff happening. So plants are really complex. They're not just like seed and then grow and then seed again. They have really complex life cycles, and there's very different life cycles depending on the type of plant. When we're thinking about that diversity of plants, like comparing the bryophytes or mosses with the pteridophytes or ferns, we're thinking about different lineages or family histories of plants. So modern plants really include gymnosperms. So these are things like pine trees, and angiosperms, which have flowers. These different lineages are as different as vertebrates and invertebrates. So just like how we wouldn't, say that we're very closely related to, for example, an insect, pine trees and roses are not very closely related. They are very separate evolutionary lineages. They actually diverged from each other, it looks like about 350 million years ago. So when we're thinking about gymnosperms, these have what are called naked seeds. They have cones. These include things like conifers, which are pine trees and evergreens, ginkgos, which is what's in the bottom right. I'm sure you've seen it growing around town before, and cycads, which are in the top right. Cycads look really similar to palm trees, but they are not closely related at all. So cycads and palm trees are completely different. These are all examples of gymnosperms, and thank you for letting me know, Gary. Their ovules, pollen, and seeds are all on cones or cone-like structures. So we'll look at some of those cones. So there's actually male and female pine cones. The male pine cones are the really small, reduced ones that have basically, they're covered in pollen. Female pine cones tend to be a lot bigger, and then they have seeds actually on them. So they have these naked scales. That's where their seeds are kept. So they're kind of out in the open. And then they have the pollen that's coming off of the male pine cones. So like how flowering plants have flowers, pine cones, that's their reproductive structure. These are also located at different parts of the tree. Those male cones tend to grow on lower branches. The pollen gets picked up by wind and by other dispersal mechanisms, and then it's a little bit easier to blow onto the top of the tree where the female pine cones are growing. So flowering plants there's so much diversity of them, in part because we continue their continued evolution. We artificially select them, we breed them together in different ways. They have really unique relationships with pollinators. By pollinators, we mean butterflies, birds, bees, moths, and then also bats. Bats are really important pollinators, and they're super cute. And so all of these different animals are attracted to nectar. They go in, they interact with the plant in different ways. They move the pollen around so that plants are able to reproduce. There's some really interesting relationships between plants and their pollinators. There's an orchid where it can only be pollinated by a particular moth that is able to stick its tongue basically into a very weirdly shaped part of the orchid and collect the nectar, and in doing so it picks up pollen. Some plants can only be kind of propagated by hand. For example, vanilla has to be kind of propagated by hand also. So when we're trying to figure out what a particular plant is, one way that we can distinguish between different lineages of flowering plants or angiosperms is by the arrangement of the vascular tissue in different parts of the plant. So we can look at this pattern and actually distinguish between what's called a monocot and a dicot, two separate lineages of flowering plants. And so that's what's being highlighted in this top right, the distinction between monocots and dicots. So there's a few different ways we distinguish between monocots. It depends on whether we're looking at kind of the flower part of the plant or what stage of development. If you put a little seed into the soil and it sprouts and it just has one little leaf sticking up, that is called a cotyledon. It's not an actual leaf. It's basically like a baby leaf or a primordial leaf. It's basically what's inside of the seed, like the baby plant. Seeds are super cute. It's basically like taking a little baby and putting a jacket around them and giving them a lunchbox and sending them off to school. They have like a little embryonic leaf in there. They have a food source, and then they have a seed coat to protect them. So if that embryonic leaf has one leaf, then it's a monocot, mono for one and cot for cotyledon. If the flower petals have multiples of 3, so like 3 or 6 or 9, it's a monocot. If the leaves have parallel veins, which are the arrangement of the vascular tissue, which you can see on that image on the bottom left, then it's a monocot. And if the root system is fibrous, if it's like very fibery, then it's a monocot. So these are all ways of telling if something is a monocot, this particular lineage of flowering plants. If you don't have the flower with you, you can check the leaves. If you are catching it right when it's sprouting, you can check the cotyledons. So things like bamboo and grass are kind of classical examples of monocots, as well as corn. Dicots tend to be a little bit more complex. These are also called eudicots. You might see them referred to that way. When they're sprouting, they have 2 little primordial leaves, which you can see in that top left image. So di for 2, cot for cotyledon. Their flower petals are in multiples of 4 or 5. If something has 12 flower petals, then you'd have to look at one of the other identifying structures because that's divisible by 3 and 4. So if their flower petals are 4 or 8 or 10, then you know for sure it's a dicot. Their leaves are also not parallel. They have palmate or pinnate venation, that kind of complex squiggly venation like you see with the maple leaf in the top right. And they have what's called a taproot. It's a much more solid root that extends downward and is less fibery, something like a carrot. So when you do get to go outside and you take a walk, you can practice identifying plants as monocots or dicots. So one other thing that we can actually look at to distinguish between a monocot and a dicot, again, are those arrangements of vascular bundles in their root or in their stem. If we're looking at a root, they basically have this circle in the middle with different arrangements of that vascular tissue. The stem is a little bit more spread out. And it turns out monocot stems are really, really cute. Let me actually go to that one really fast. So I really like this meme, my face when I find out what grass cells look like, and you can just see them, like they look like little faces. And so these are arrangements of that vascular tissue. They also kind of remind me of the tree spirits, the Kodama from Princess Mononoke. They kind of look like these arrangements of vascular tissue in plants. So that is one way of telling if something is a monocot or a dicot. It's a little bit more challenging if you don't have a microscope. So going back really fast to those root systems, either way, you have these different apical meristems creating new growth. If it's a taproot, it's a dicot, it's a little bit more clumped together. If it's a fibrous root, it's a monocot, and so it's a little bit more spread out. And of course, I had to include the roots in there. Okay, so this link is to that Three Sisters demonstration garden at Madera Center. Hopefully some of you will get to return to campus at some point and check it out. It's open to the public too, and there's a garden day in November where people can go and volunteer there. So it's like a nice place to take a walk and clear your head. It is put together by the University of California Extension Program, the Master Gardener Program, and it's in collaboration with Madera Community College Center. So it's a resource for basically anyone in Madera County or anyone who's visiting there. You can just go. You might have to pay for parking unless it's relaxed, and then you could just walk around. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. So for the next half hour of class, I'm going to go through some of those different plants that are located there and share a little bit about them. For the next exam, I'm not expecting you to know about all of these plants, but for a written question, one of the short answers, I'm expecting you to remember at least 2 of these plants and 1 interesting fact about each of those. So as we go through, think about which ones stand out to you, jot down a couple of notes, and then other than that, just focus on how pretty and awesome all of this is. And just imagine you're like walking around the garden if we were back on campus. Okay, so I'm just gonna close some windows really fast. This first one is called lamb's ear. And let me see if I can minimize this window even further. Okay, so these are like very soft. They're a pretty silvery green color. They're native to Armenia, Iran, and Turkey. So a lot of the plants that grow well in the Central Valley also grow well in a Mediterranean or Middle Eastern climate. These lamb's ears can also be used medicinally or as an herb, like in cooking. They actually have been shown in some cases to have antimicrobic activity. So there's a particular species of bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus. It causes a lot of severe infections, and if you've heard of MRSA or staph infections, that's Staphylococcus aureus. So this lamb's ear has been shown to have some activity against even drug-resistant strains of Staph aureus. The flowers are really tiny. Let me have them pop up. They're like these little tiny purple clusters, but pollinators really love these plants. And when I was walking around the garden, I actually saw bees on these, even though there were no flowers. So what's happening there is some bees actually take that fuzz off of the plants and they make nests in rotting wood. So they actually harvest that fuzz and they use it to create their homes. This was another cute one, the amber gold mugo pine. It's a pine tree, but it grows super slowly. So it only grows about 2 feet every 10 years. So not necessarily something you would use for like a Christmas tree. It changes from this yellow-green color to amber gold in the winter time. I put a placeholder in there. I didn't catch that. I was gonna put more information about it, but it just grows really slowly. So that was another one that I took a picture of. Here's one called a Serbian spruce, which is also very tiny. It grows about 3 feet every 10 years, and it has this really pretty silvery blue underside to the needles. So again, these are gymnosperms. They have those little cones for their reproduction. This one is called the golden goblin. It's a hybrid Gaillardia grandiflora. It's an ornamental plant. It's a cross between 2 species of Gaillardia. So a lot of plants do like super cool stuff with their genetics. This one is a tetraploid. It actually has 4 sets of chromosomes. So remember, we talked about how dramatic the effects could be if we have even 1 extra chromosome. It has a total of 4 sets of chromosomes. So plants have wild genetics. This next picture I didn't take, I got it from the internet, but these plants are also called blanket flowers because they look like indigenous blankets, and they're really, really pretty. These ones were kind of starting to wilt by the time I took a picture of them, but you can see like in their glory what this color looks like. This one is called Autumn Sage. I did take these pictures. It has these really narrow leaves that are super tough, which makes it resistant to water loss. And they're also kind of like spicy. They have a spicy fragrance to them. If you ever see them in person, you can kind of like rub the leaves and smell them. That stops deer from eating them. So they're really resistant to prey species, to herbivores. They are green year-round, and they are also really great for attracting pollinators to your garden. Those leaves, because they are kind of spicy, can be used for seasonings and teas, and their flowers are actually edible. This one is called the California fuchsia. The bottom left image is the one that I took in the garden. The top right is from the internet, but it's super pretty. I just love this color, and it grows really well in what's called chaparral. Chaparral is found in Mediterranean climates. It's like the foothills and the mountains surrounding the Central Valley. That's all chaparral. So the plants that grow there have to be kind of resistant to low moisture environments. So these plants are drought tolerant. This California fuchsia also really does a good job of attracting hummingbirds and other pollinators. This one is another type of fuchsia that they had in the garden. It's called the Sierra Salmon variant, and it has this really pretty salmon color on its stems. So the top left image here are just starting to bloom Icelandic poppies. And so in the top right, you can see what they're actually going to look like. These are different from our California poppies, which are a state flower and are pictured in the bottom of this image. So these Icelandic poppies do a really good job of surviving cold winters, like in Iceland, but they can't grow in heat. So if you notice in this garden, they were planted in a pot because they're gonna die as soon as it starts heating up again. But they have really interesting genetics. Usually when a flower or kind of skin color, if something is white, it tends to be recessive. But in this case, the white allele is actually dominant. So that's kind of interesting. And they're also extremely toxic. So the flowers are not edible. Poppies in general have a lot of interesting things happening. That's how we got opium. So ginkgo is another one. Ginkgo is so interesting because it's actually more closely related to pine trees than it is to like flowering plants. But when we look at it, we don't think of it as being like a pine tree. So it's also called the maidenhair tree. It turns this beautiful gold color. It can grow really big, up to 80 feet by 40 feet. And the leaves turn that bright yellow color in the fall. It's a very ancient species. All of its relatives are now extinct, and it's a very distant relative of pine trees, like I mentioned. It's extremely important in cooking and traditional medicine, particularly throughout a lot of parts of Asia. And there are separate males and females. So some plants are called monoecious. They have both male and female parts in the same plants. Others are called dioecious. They have two separate male and female versions. So these ones, if you get a ginkgo tree, you want to make sure you get a male because the females produce these really swollen ovules that drop to the ground and smell really nasty. So they get squishy, they kind of ruin your concrete. So if you buy a ginkgo tree, make sure that you get a male tree. But this is a picture I took. You can see the leaves starting to sprout. They're super cute. This one is a kumquat, and it is native to China. It's a very drought-tolerant citrus, so it produces really well in low moisture environments, and the rind is actually super sweet. So with a lot of citrus fruits, you have to kind of like candy the rind and cook it and process it if you want to eat it. With this, you can pop it whole in your mouth. It's super sweet and can be eaten whole. So that also grows really well in Fresno. This one is the winter jasmine. It was thriving because we're just coming out of winter and into spring. It's also native to China, and it can grow quite high, up to 10 to 15 feet in height. It's really good for preventing erosion because it grows well on slopes and it forms ground cover. So plants are really important. Their root systems hold dirt in place. That's why sensitive areas like dunes, it's so important to have that ground cover and to have plants there, and to not destroy those fragile ecosystems. So when we remove a lot of plants, we get more and more soil erosion that leaches into the water, and then it contaminates water systems. This one is ornamental cabbage. Ornamental cabbage is basically a catch-all term for any type of cabbage that has this unique pattern around its leaves. It's also called decorative or flowering cabbage. Some versions are called Osaka flowering cabbage, but they have these bright leaves with contrasting edges. They grow about 1 foot tall. Since they're bred specifically for their looks, they don't necessarily have a good flavor profile. They're pretty bitter, but they are sometimes used decoratively in cooking. And they are edible, they just don't taste very good. So this is one thing that I also wanted to touch base on from that evolution lecture, is this idea of artificial selection. The mechanism for evolution is natural selection. Basically, different individuals within a population have different adaptations. They survive and reproduce according to what does best in the environment, and the ones that reproduce, the population looks like them over time. With artificial selection, humans are acting as the environment. We breed together specific plants or animals with characteristics that we like and we want more of. So we are artificially selecting for certain characteristics. So for example, if you eat kohlrabi or kale or broccoli or Brussels sprouts or cabbage or cauliflower, all of those don't exist in the wild. They have been bred over time through artificial selection from wild mustard. So basically, some people really like the leaves. If a particular wild mustard had big leaves, they kept breeding it together. Eventually we get kale. If you really like the lateral leaf buds, eventually you get Brussels sprouts. So thousands of years of careful crop interactions and breeding have led to these different species of cruciferous vegetables that we eat. So again, all of these evolved from wild mustard. People bred those characteristics that they liked together for thousands of years. This one was really pretty. It's this like pale creamy white color or yellow color. It's called Tasmanian tiger spurge. It's very tolerant of drought and sun. So again, it grows super well in Fresno. And it's also really resistant to herbivores like rabbits, gophers, and deer. So if you live kind of out in the country and you have to deal with things eating your plants a lot, this is a good option. It also attracts a lot of pollinators. So it attracts butterflies, hummingbirds, different things like that, and it provides a really pretty color for your garden. This one is called the Dr. Hurd manzanita. This manzanita in general, Arctostaphylos, are so important, especially in California and to indigenous communities. So if you ever are hiking and it gets really hot, the temperature inside of manzanita groves is actually about 10 degrees colder than the surrounding environment. So if you are burning up or if you're lost, crawl under some manzanita and wait for help, because that is your best chance on a hot day. Their leaves also retain a lot of water and have a lot of medicinal properties, so you can get water that way as well. Things like cactus, you do not want to drink the water from cactus because they have tons of psychedelics in them and a lot of poisons too. So don't drink water from cacti, but from manzanita, it's fine. So these are used ornamentally. They're grown throughout California. There's some extremely rare species that are found in San Francisco. And there's many indigenous applications. If you make an infusion with the leaves, it treats poison oak rash and also urinary tract infections. The leaves can be used as toothbrushes. The berries are really tasty on their own, or they can make a meal that can be used to cook other things. They can be used as a thickener or a sweetener or for cider. And then if you guys are just coming in late, don't stress about it, just let me know. And then the wood itself makes really hot fires, so it's super useful for cooking and keeping warm. So again, if you are lost and you are underneath Manzanita, you can probably survive for a little bit longer because you can keep cool during the day, you can keep warm at night, and you can eat it and kind of stay hydrated and healthy. This one is called Ruby Glow. It's also native to Turkey as well as Europe and part of the Caucasus. It's also related to poinsettias, so those red plants that are common in around Christmas time. It has really complex flowers. If you look at the bottom right image, you can kind of see that it looks like it has flowers with like other flowers sprouting out of it. So that's called an inflorescence. It's not really a flower, but it's a little bit more complicated. These grow really well in dry shade. So if you have a house that blocks the sun and it's really dry and nothing else grows there super well, you can plant these. Again, resistant to rabbits, gophers, and deer. It does have a like sappy fluid called latex that is really toxic and causes skin irritation. So these grow super well, but you just want to be cautious about planting them. This one is English lavender. This is used in so many different applications. It grows well in Mediterranean climates. It's not flammable, so you can plant it close to buildings. It's really drought tolerant. And a lot of people like lavender for its aromatherapy applications. It's very soothing. It can be used medicinally in oils and teas. There's nothing better than a lavender cream Earl Grey besides proper chai. It's used for massage therapy, for different home uses. It can prevent moths from coming in and destroying your clothes. So lavender is super useful. This one is called Stonecrop Angelina. It's a drought-tolerant species, and it's really grows well in rock gardens. So if you are trying to avoid planting a lot of grass, you can kind of create rock gardens and plant this cover throughout it to save water. This one is called Yarrow Apple Blossom. The picture on the left is from our garden. The picture on the right is from the Amarisa Garden, so a place I found online. This one is sun and drought tolerant, and the flowers are super pretty, so it's useful for like cutting and making bouquets with them. This is called the pink mist pincushion flower. So there's a lot of flowers called pincushion flowers or pincushion plants. They have these flower structures that kind of look like pincushions. They are found all over the place, and again, they attract a lot of pollinators. They also are a great spot for pollinators to lay their eggs. This one is called Walker's Low Catmint. It is related to catnip. So that's the gift that I'm showing is a cat that's really enjoying some catnip. I think about 2/3 to 3/4 of cats respond to catnip, and then there's just a fraction of them that don't have any response. So this one is a relative of catnip that's found in our garden. This one in particular has won a lot of awards. It's like a super special species. It attracts pollinators, and it's super resistant towards pests like aphids. So if you struggle with a lot of those things contaminating your garden, this could be useful. There's a really big succulent garden there as well. And then there's some information on what we call butterfly puddling. This is basically where you make these little dishes for butterflies to come and hang out on. So if you, again, want to attract more pollinators, I included a picture of the instructions so you could maybe make a little pollinator garden for yourself as well. And then another way to attract pollinators, there's just so many good videos of dogs with butterflies. So I just wanted to end on that note. So I don't think your dog is naturally going to attract butterflies, but you might get lucky. So there was some more information about the Three Sisters Garden. In the past, there's been, yeah, just kind of blessing your group chat here. There's been group therapy offered in the garden too. I don't know if they've done that recently, but it's something to keep an eye out for when we return back to campus. And then right now there's a lot of virtual tours going on. In that resource I posted to Canvas with the K-12 resources, there's a ton of virtual tours of museums and different places, and there's tons of virtual tours of botanical gardens. So I linked a bunch of them here. And then this one, let me see if I can get it to play. It's a long video, so we'll just watch part of it. It's from the New York Botanical Garden. So there's just, it's particularly the orchid show. So there's a bunch of orchids. I think some of these are interactive. Others, it's just like kind of like a walking tour where they show you different images and then they show you information about it. And then this guy like tells you about it. So you can kind of like sit and watch and pretend like you're on this walking tour, or you could just like go out, take a walk around the block. As long as you're careful about that and maintain 6 feet between you and anyone else walking around, it is fine for you to go outside. So if you want to go and like practice identifying monocots or dicots, or just get some air because you've been stuck inside, it is safe to do that. Just maintain social distancing.